seminars for no charge to students, alums, anybody who's interested, and we'll introduce that a little bit more as we get to the fourth quarter. So we're about halfway to our $10,000 goal for the general fund for this month. So we appreciate that. We do have a anonymous donor who next week is going to pledge $2,500 as a matching gift. So we just need $2,500 more. We'll hit the 10,000. And the other thing I'm really excited about is, as many of you know, we are sponsoring a park revitalization in a low to moderate income community outside of Philadelphia. We have a goal of raising $550,000 for that park. And to date, we've raised $368,000. So we're very close to hitting our goal. We've had wonderful support from a number of major companies, as well as a lot of smaller organizations and a lot of individuals. So you can find more info on that on our website or on the park's website, Dr. Adams Community Park. The last thing I'll add before we jump into introducing the speakers is this will be the last speaker series event we do until September, respecting folks' summers, and of course a summer where I think hopefully a lot of us will be able to get out and travel. But it's not going to deny you from continuing the important dialogue we have. In April, we'll talk about at the end of the discussion today some of the really neat things we have planned for the summer to keep the topic and the mission going, and the dialogue between folks that Finale and Maura McKenna, our two board members, helped design. So that's just a couple of quick updates before we jump in. So also, as many of you know, we cover a number of topics each month, and starting in January, we focused on specific areas of inequality, racism-driven inequality, particularly towards African Americans, and focused on items that really had real-time impacts to them, whether it was health due to the virus, employment, education, wealth. And April and I felt that this topic, to conclude at least this section of the speaker series, was probably the most important, because in my mind, it's the really most egregious that you can look back on history, and specifically as it relates to government policies and government actions causing us to be at the place we are with inequality in housing, and how that impacts all the other areas that we've talked about earlier. So, our goal really is to educate you today with some great speakers with the topic of racism and housing inequality. So we appreciate you joining. So let me introduce our panelists for tonight and our facilitator. So first, I'd like to introduce Willie Jones. In September 2014, Willie retired from his position as Senior Vice President and Director of the Community Builders Incorporated after nearly 25 years with the organization. Willie was responsible for new project and program development across 16 states and the District of Columbia. In 2009, Willie led the project team in winning a $78 million NSP2 award. This funding supported the development of over 1,500 units of housing. Willie managed the loan program for this initiative, and in 2012, he led another project team in securing nearly $30 million in funding for a revitalization program in Cincinnati, Ohio. Willie has received multiple awards throughout his career and his work in affordable housing and community economic and development, particularly his work against redlining in urban minority neighborhoods. He was one of the architects behind creating the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation and served as the first community co-chair of the Massachusetts Community and Banking Council. Because of this work, he completed a 3-year term on the Consumer Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Bank. In 2015, Willie was inducted into the Affordable Housing Finance Magazine's Hall of Fame for his contributions to the field of affordable housing. Since retiring, Willie has been very, very active, continues to be very active, and focused on strengthening the intersection between the faith community and community economic development and fighting for racial equity. He now lives in the Charlotte area and is the board president of a church-affiliated CDC in Charlotte, North Carolina. He assisted in closing the financing on 112-unit family and 72-unit elderly affordable housing projects, both in rapidly gentrifying African-American neighborhoods. He also helped a local Presbyterian church draft an RFP and select a development partner to invest $2 million from its capital campaign to produce affordable housing. Willie's a 1974 graduate of Brown University with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in sociology, concentrating in urban planning. And before joining the Community Builders, he served as an assistant to the dean at the College of Engineering at Northwestern University. While employed at the Community Builders, he also served on the faculty at Tufts University's Urban and Environmental Policy Program and at MIT and the MIT Development of Urban Studies and Planning Professional Development Institute. There's many more items about Willie's wonderful career and his bio on our website, but Willie, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. Christine Chattels, I'd like to introduce next, and we're thrilled to have Christine join us. She is the head of community banking and client protection, serving consumer and small business clients at Bank of America. Christine's responsible for Bank of America's community banking, which aims to increase financial resilience and create economic mobility by making investments that align with the Community Reinvestment Act, Hispanic Latino priorities, and technology initiatives. The community banking team also strives to provide jobs as well as access to core banking products and services, loans, and capital to help communities grow and thrive. She also leads the Client Prevention Group, which oversees operations related to fraud prevention, detection, and resolution, ensuring clients' finances and information are kept safe and secure. This includes fraud detection, prevention, claims, recovery, billing, disputes, anti-money laundering, controls, operational excellence, and employee conduct. Christine and her leadership team are also responsible for designing and implementing operational excellence efforts in supporting of the 70,000 employees in consumer and small business to drive responsible growth, deliver client care, and foster a strong risk culture and an operationally sound environment. Christine has worked for Bank of America for almost 20 years. She joined the company in 2002 and has held various leadership roles within consumer as well as compliance and global technology and operations. Christine currently serves as chairman of the board for the Consumer Bankers Association on the boards of the American Red Cross and the Charlotte Ballet. She's also actively supports junior teammen, devoting time to volunteering in the local schools. So Christine, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Finally, we have the wonderful privilege of having a guest facilitator who many of you know. She is a CommonBondz Board Member, Finale Norton. Finale was born in Exmoor, a small rural town in the Eastern Shore of Virginia, where she grew up. In 1985, Finale earned her bachelor's degree in human ecology with a concentration in marketing. She was the first in her family to do so. Her goal was to get a job after college so she could put cleaning clam buckets at 4 a.m., picking tomatoes, and being a waitress behind her. After college, she went to work in a retail store, entering their management associate program until marrying her college sweetheart in 1986, our good friend Sam Norton, who was our speaker back in November. Finale went on to work for Bank of America in 1988 and had a significant rise in her career working for Bank of America. She was selected for the management associate program, and from there she spent 10 years managing bank branches. She then moved up to manage at a regional level, and in 2003 became an executive of the company, managing the marketing in South Carolina and then Hampton Roads, Virginia. In 2008, she moved to Atlanta, Georgia to run the largest market in the Southeast. And then she ended up in 2010 coming back to Hampton Roads to run the consumer contact centers across the country, more than 2,000 contact center associates. In 2015, Finale retired from Bank of America and spent a year at Accenture, a consulting group. She then retired from there and has set up 2 sole proprietorships, Common Sense Consulting and Rich Girl, Poor Girl. There's a number of other things that are in Finale's bio, but one of the things I want to mention here is a comment that she has in her bio that basically says that though Finale did okay by her standards in corporate America, she says she found incredible courage after the death of George Floyd to reassess her 26-year career. She has spoken out. She found the courage to speak out in different social media platforms and say what others will not, and give voice to those who may not yet have the courage to speak the truth. She also mentioned she was just getting wound up. We asked her to join our board, and she is wound up. And she is also a candidate right now, the Democratic nominee for the Virginia House of Delegates District 100, with the election being in November. So somebody who really is putting action around her words and her passion. So, Finale, we are honored to have you facilitate this evening, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. I am so excited for this particular speaker series. I had an opportunity to talk with Willie and Christine, but this is just a topic that I've been passionate about. So the last series, we had Ed Hawthorne and the two guests, and they spent a lot of time talking about wealth. And I think that this is perfect because home ownership is the American dream, and it is the way that we create wealth. And it is the way that wealth is transferred from generation to generation. And that has been a real struggle for Black Americans. And so I think tonight in this discussion, hopefully we will uncover a lot of things that you may not have thought about in terms of how home ownership creates wealth, but really all the barriers that Black Americans and people of color have had to go through. So I thought it fitting, after having the conversation with both Willie and Christine, that we start with Willie, because he has an amazing way that he threads this to sort of begin to talk about how race and this home ownership thing feeds together. So Willie, can we start with the conversation that you and I had about these two important points that you think is important for folks to hear, to walk through the door, to understand this discussion?
Thank you, Finale. I hope I can do it as well. As you get a certain age, the first time you say something is way more profound than the follow-up conversation. So I will do my best. I want to start off with 2 points and then kind of launch into the place that Finale was mentioning. I think the first. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my wife said can't hear you very well, so let me move the microphone. I hope this is better. Okay. In our work with the local group that I'm on the board of, Unity and Community North MEC, I helped put together study guides for the small groups. One of the things that came up in our meetings and when we were launching into study guides over the last 2 years is really trying to get a handle on what is whiteness. And I want to use that as a foundational question to get to discrimination. So the first question of what is whiteness forced me to kind of go back and study the evolution of whiteness. And why racial inequality and lack of equity is so stubborn. And I think what it boils down to is there was an article I was reading that said culture is to people what water is to fish. It is everywhere. It is necessary. We use it to propel ourselves forward and navigate. We can't move or function without it, but we don't notice it. In fact, we don't notice it at all until there's a change. And everyone experiences culture, but most have a difficult time recognizing it or describing it. I was working with a group of Alaskan Native leaders as they were trying to define and identify culture as one of their core values. One of the leaders stood up and said, "This is just what we do. It isn't something we can define." And I think that's a shorthand, that's the Reader's Digest version of culture. And so you have to ask the question, how does discrimination become normalized in culture? How does it become reinforcing? How does it become a mainstay? How does it not only get institutionalized in law, but gets institutionalized in how we relate to each other, the images that we think of, how we classify each other, etc. And so I want to go back, first off, I want to go back and try to recreate how we got here and to do it from a historical perspective, not just sentiment, but just historically how this happened. And I wanted to start off by going back to if we can get on our boat and go back to 1619 and try to understand the appearance of African Americans in the U.S. And African Americans came at a time where there was a tremendous labor shortage. The king had these colonies, and he gave land to his friends, and so you had these huge land grants. So you had rich people, but they didn't have nobody to work for them. So there was a need for labor. So they began to grab everybody they could grab out of England. Okay, so they let them out of jail, grabbed them up off the street. There were stories about women creating lies about their husbands so their husbands could get yanked away and they could be out of their oppressive relationships, etc. So that was kind of the backdrop. At that time, Africans were the same essentially as indentured servants. There was no real difference between Africans, indentured servants, and there was a 10-to-1 ratio between men to women. But there was marriage between blacks and European, English white women was relatively common. Okay, so there was a degree of equality operating within a society, even though there was a high degree of poverty. And so what kind of happened? How do you go from that situation to a very different situation that's part of our reality? The pivotal historical event was something called Baker's Rebellion. And I don't know if anybody here remembers enough about high school history to remember Baker's Rebellion. I didn't, so I had to go back and figure out what it was. Baker's Rebellion happened in Virginia. Now, Virginia and Maryland were the British colonies responsible for production of tobacco. So the land grants produced tobacco, which was hugely labor intensive. Baker's Rebellion happened when Nathaniel Bacon, who was not the nice guy himself, he was a rich guy with a land grant from the king, but he wanted more land. And the only way he could get more land was by taking it from Native Americans. So he told the governor, I want you to go and kill me some more Native Americans so I can get some more land. Well, the governor said, I don't want to do that. And so Baker started a fight. Baker's army was made up primarily of former indentured servants, free blacks, and some Native Americans. At the end of that, when Baker's Rebellion was put down, the governors came to the conclusion that we'll never keep these colonies if people are allowed to come together, and they're way more than us. A few landowners and everybody else is basically our workers. So what happened was they petitioned the king and created a new policy, which was called divide and conquer. And the essence of this policy was to give European rights that blacks didn't have. And so there were laws passed starting in 1641 to 1691, where little by little, they began to change the rights that English had from the rights that free blacks had. So the first thing they did was they prohibited blacks from holding office. Blacks and natives were prohibited from marrying whites. Whites required, at the end of indenture, you were required to give essentially like a bounty to the servants who were released. Whites were required to be paid goods, including guns and powder, at the end of their indenture. Free blacks were prohibited from possessing weapons. Blacks were prohibited from testifying against whites. So the cumulative creation over a 2-decade period, where you began to see a divergence in rights between blacks and whites, began to get normalized. That became the struggle. That became the framework that launched us into slavery and all the years following that. But if we didn't have that event to trigger a distinction between free blacks, slaves, and slaves then were a category of bond servant. So if you were an indentured servant, servitude would last from 7 to 14 years. Those on the 14-year in scale, the term slave was used interchangeably for someone who had the longer indenture. Okay, so the point I'm making there is that there's a distinction, and that distinction became codified in law. That became part of Maryland law, part of Virginia law, and then that law began to be adopted state by state over the 13 colonies. Okay, and that was the institutionalization of the difference between blacks and whites. And so if you can think about it for a second, it's way more fun to be on the end of having rights than on the end of having no rights. And so European immigrants, as they came in, they could easily adopt the notion of being white because there was no there was no incentive whatsoever to be black. And so if you can think about how that then manifests itself, it gets, not only is it in law, but it begins to get captured in culture, in religion, in institutions. And so you see this thing where over time, the acceptance of, and following this was the determination that blacks couldn't take whites to court. So if you were at the end of your indenture and they wouldn't release you, then you didn't have recourse. Okay, so which then set up the framework for slavery. And so now that happened over several decades, but it was institutionalized step by step by step. And so I wanted to lay that foundation to then understand how we struggle with different periods. So by the time we got to slavery, the whole notion of no rights was normalized. And it was an accepted condition within America. Now, if we now there were very few changes under slavery. So let us fast forward to Reconstruction in the Civil War. The U.S. had an opportunity to well, we used to, in kids we used to call it, you want a do-over. So the U.S. had an opportunity to get a do-over done. When slaves were freed, the Union Army was in the South to enforce the laws, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And the problem was that the disparity between blacks and whites was so entrenched that the landowners couldn't think of another way of production other than free labor. That's what was so institutionalized in their lives. Okay,
So Willie,
yes.
so let me bring us up then, because I think that's really good. And I think that's giving folks a really good foundation for how we got here. And I think I know for myself, when you think about housing, you don't think about how this all begins, and that puts it together. Can you bring us forward now to Reconstruction, and then let's talk about what it was like for blacks in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, now that they have the ability to buy a house after the New Deal. What happened? How did we get here?
The do-over in Reconstruction was one where the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment gave us a set of rights that made people roughly equal. However, those were enforced by federal troops. Once federal troops were pulled out of the South, the and all of the states signed the 13th Amendment, then at that time, the Democrats took over again, and all those rights were abolished. All right, so at the end of Reconstruction, which lasted about 11 years, we went from a situation where the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, as well as Black elected officials, were able to make several changes. So you had HBCUs were created during that period. Public education was created during Reconstruction. Public funded hospitals were created during Reconstruction. Following that, well, during Reconstruction, there was always a struggle because, the 40 acres and a mule was never implemented. And so the whole notion of land ownership among Blacks was a tenuous notion. Following that, at the end, when the troops were pulled out, the whole ownership structure collapsed back. And so the whole issue then of Black ownership of land became more difficult, and it in fact became illegal in most southern states in one form or another. So if we fast forward to the 1900s, was when Blacks began owning homes. And you had small Black farmers, but most Blacks were sharecroppers, but you also had the movement of Blacks to the north. And so for the first time, you had neighborhoods where you had large numbers of people who actually owned homes. The structural issue was segregation there because they couldn't get typical debt. The way the houses were refinanced or financed from Reconstruction until the New Deal was you would have to pay roughly 50% down, and then you would get a mortgage. But most Blacks couldn't afford 50% down. And so most Blacks lived in rental housing. And that was the norm from up to the 60s, that was the norm. What was significant here, and I think Christine will go into this in more detail later, but what was significant here is that as we moved to the New Deal, all of the New Deal programs excluded Blacks. In order to get the New Deal passed, Roosevelt cut a deal with Southern Democrats to not include Blacks in any of the legislation. Okay, so the creation of the FHA and mortgages and amortizing mortgages, et cetera, Blacks couldn't get FHA mortgages. All of the New Deal programs segregated Blacks and whites. And in the CCC, the Conservation Corps, they had a different wage scale for Blacks and whites. And workers in the WPA, CCC, they had to stay in different places. So there was a structured segregation that existed as a function of the New Deal legislation. It also meant that the New Deal legislation did not cover sharecroppers. Minimum wage did not cover sharecroppers. Social Security did not cover sharecroppers. And there was a law that was part of this package that did not allow domestic workers to organize. Okay, so there was no way that women could increase the quality of their lives based on these new laws that were being passed. Okay, so that then created this situation where Black ownership still relied on a model of large down payments. But because you couldn't get good paying jobs, you couldn't have large down payments. So therefore, Blacks were relegated consistently to rental housing as this nature of neighborhoods. And then when we get up to the New Deal and beyond, the whole question of you had public education that was passed during Reconstruction. You had public hospitals. You had a series of public things that were part now of local budgets. But then those things became segregated and then underfunded. Okay, so when you created because of segregation, whenever you had a Black neighborhood, it was largely a rental neighborhood. But it was also largely a neighborhood that was short of resources and short of amenities. And so little by little, the divergence, and it created a situation that by 1960s, you had slums because you couldn't get the same capital involved in turning the houses over, and you couldn't access the mortgage markets the way that they had historically been done during the New Deal. Okay. So why don't I turn that over to Christine?
Yeah.
So we're now at the point now where we're talking about programs.
Yes.
We're talking about what happens after the Voting Rights Act. What happens after the things that were supposed to correct all of these problems, but didn't correct the problems. So I'm handing it to you, Christine.
So before you go,
Thank you.
let me bring up a couple of points that I think are really important here when we were talking about African Americans in the 30s and 40s and 50s and even in the 60s, but specifically the 40s and 50s when they were not allowed to live in suburbs, which means that when we talk about building wealth, you're not able to build the wealth. So what happened is they weren't able to get those FHA loans and those VA mortgages that white families were able to get, even though they were making the same money. So when you take that and you fast forward, we're talking about intergenerational wealth, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, where now one set of folks have the ability to send their kids to college, take care of themselves in old age. They're building wealth, while these folks who had the same opportunity because they had the same cash, they weren't able to do that. And so when you start thinking about how these things sort of pass through, this is how it passes through. But then later, the regulations are supposed to start to fix some of that. So Christine, let's talk a little bit about how, after the federal government really institutionalized this disparity in wealth, how do they themselves?
Yeah, that's a great one, Chanel. And I will say I wrote down Baker's Rebellion because, Willie, I didn't remember that in high school. And yeah, I'm going to go back and learn more about that. It's a good call. Yeah, in 69, we saw the Fair Housing Act pass. And then in 77, we saw the Community Reinvestment Act come through. And, you know, these federal housing policies were created to really address inequities in home lending, specifically for Black Americans and other communities of color. And while they look good on the surface, when you get to the heart of how these things are really done, there is such inequity, and it's systematic when you start looking at it. And I can give you some examples that we've seen, and I say this not in past tense. There are still pieces of this that are root cause problems that need to be addressed. But so we've got laws that are saying explicitly that you can't discriminate. And Willie's called out, you know, a 50% down payment because your skin color is brown, and, you know, 10% if it's white, obviously is a systematic issue. You also have issues with steering. And we talk about this with, when you think about what steering is, you have real estate agents that when they know they're selling to a person of color versus a white person, they pick different neighborhoods. And so it starts to naturally change the prospective homes that are available. And then you've got predatory lending issues. You've got issues around structural disparity. And that's when affordable homes are disproportionately situated in geographic areas that are segregated. And these situations and periods of economic uncertainty where our LMI communities are often impacted more harshly. And you can see it in the climate, not to kind of jump around, but I was thinking about it when we were talking about these neighborhoods. It's not only that they're segregated, they're often in low-lying neighborhoods. And so when you look at, you know, flood zones and other issues, you are now giving a person a house, which in most families and most people's lives, it is their biggest investment. It is a source of wealth. It's supposed to help, you know, develop over time and grow your financial future. And if you are being put into a segregated neighborhood in a flood zone and you're going to lose your wealth, I mean, you're disproportionately impacted. And some of these things still go on today. And we see the LMI communities are hit at a higher rate. And we saw it this past year when you look at what happened with the pandemic, and you look at what happened to LMI communities, they were hit harder. We saw higher rates of infection, we saw higher rates of death and job loss and income loss, and that affects homes. And there has been some financial assistance that's been put out into the public. I know this past year we saw many lenders, move pretty quickly to make sure that we could stabilize and avoid, mortgage loss, and really working on payment assistance programs, whether it's your home or your car. And there's been government support to help, but focusing on financial resiliency really is a challenge, and it's really uncertain for many. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. I think the history of why we are here is really important, because as we're looking at new policy changes that are getting ready to be implemented, and we have quite a few in the forefront with the new administration, it's important to understand how we got here, so that once we correct, that we make sure we're making the right changes, because it is going to take more than a financial institution or a government agency. It's going to take a collaboration across a lot of groups for us to really get at the root cause and fix this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This is a point that I was reading, and I thought that it was really important, that over the last 15 years, Black home ownership has declined more dramatically than for any other racial or ethnic group. In 2019, Black home ownership, the rate was as low as it was in the 60s, when private race-based discrimination was legal. And so I think that's pretty telling in terms of still some of the disparity that's going on. And we know what the federal government has put in place, but someone mentions here in the chat, and I think it's really important, and that is just today, if you were to think about me, if I were to sell my home and I have an appraiser come in and he would appraise my home, but I could have exactly the same home, someone else could, and a white man could come in and they would appraise his home for more. So I think your point about, an institution can't do it on its own, but we have to figure out solutions that solve when private people, whether they're real estate appraisers, whether they are agents, what are your thoughts? How are you guys thinking about, you get to issues like that?
And I'll start, and Willie, we can jointly answer. I think one of the big pieces, the biggest barrier for home ownership is that down payment and closing costs. When you're living and working on saving and building credit, that is a large amount of money to come up with right up from the start. So what we've seen is putting together affordable banking solutions, and that's really important. One of the big areas where institutions can get involved, financial institutions, is to work through how to provide homes to more people. I work at Bank of America, as Mike shared earlier, and we've put together a commitment. Just recently, we tripled our commitment. We were talking about a $5 billion commitment, but we've made it $15 billion. And with $15 billion, we're able to put 60,000 people and their families into homes. And that's what institutions need to be doing, financial institutions, working to help families get into homes and making the assistance that's needed. Because on average, a home's about $17,500 that you would have to come up with to get the down payment, to get the closing costs, to get into a house. So it's grants and programs like this that really make a difference, that need to be looked at across, and other institutions really helping across the space to help with that.
Yeah, I think you also have to find ways of equalizing the playing field in other dimensions. So for instance, municipalities spend differentially on amenities in African-American neighborhoods. That's a public policy issue. And it's something that's under the control of voters. And so where you invest for pools, where you invest for libraries, where you invest very often for things like transit stops. How do you reroute buses? How do you get buses going from neighborhoods more directly to actual employment centers? So you maybe catch one bus instead of three. I think all those things are part of the universe of what we have to tackle to begin to create degrees of equality, and we shouldn't forget the moral. I know it sounds. I'm also an ordained minister, so I'll just say this: we shouldn't forget the moral and ethical responsibilities that we hold our church and our civic institutions to. This whole thing about a nod and a wink, and truly horrific things happen, and our institutions don't speak out against it. So I think what Christine was saying, and for now, that's on the economic side, but you got to change some minds also to change some behavior. And I think that's part of what I think is the other part of the package that we need to do as citizens.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would think about in this is, the way that you go about getting a loan. And Christine, you were talking about this in terms of the down payment and all of those things. And we know that there's credit scoring. And I think that that's one of the ways that institutions really have to rethink it, because you can sort of look at the root cause of how we got here. And then you look at credit scoring. That's one of the things that's sort of used to sort of count people out. So how do you get past that so that you say, okay, well, we've got data and we're using algorithms and analytics to decide who should get a loan and who shouldn't. But at the same time, we know that there's some root cause stuff there that created that deficit. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but that really is something that has to be tackled. And whether it's some type of education, whether it's different kinds of programs, what is your thinking on how you might tackle that? Because we still have this data that shows us that we're disproportionately behind. Credit risk scoring is one of those that causes that. What do you think?
I think there's got to be more transparency in credit risk scores, and you've started to see it in the last few years. If you have a credit card or with your banks, you're seeing your FICO scores constantly being reported to you, and they're telling you how they're calculating it and how many accounts you have open that they're looking at, regardless of whether it's with them or with others. And as a consumer, I appreciate that. I want that transparency. I'm always looking at mine and my husband's and questioning why his would be higher. Is that a gender thing? I'm, not to open that, but, I look at some of those aspects. But, when it comes to how to do this, I mean, one of the ways that we found effective and that part of our community banking approach is really focusing on helping people build and repair credit, giving the transparency to how credit is evaluated, how it's calculated, but also like what are some of the key products and services you can offer. And so the bank has developed things like a secured credit card. So you want to build credit for the first time. You don't want to get totally into a credit card game. This gives you a chance to start to build up your credit and you watch it improve over time. Education, I think, has been a real gap. And I went through a public education and, you mentioned waiting tables. I waited tables all through high school and college. I did not understand finances very well. I figured it out along the way, probably overdraft a couple times on my tuition in college and had to fix it. But, it was one of those things I learned along the way. And what I found is we have spent a lot of time the last several years building with the Khan Academy basic education around finances, and it's really needed. It's something that I think is aloof, for people think that's for people with money, but everyone needs to know the basics of financials and how to build credit and how to save. And we've seen real success with the products and building credit and seeing savings. Surprisingly, this past year, and I look at data a lot for our low to moderate income neighborhoods, we have seen a significant growth in deposits and savings. I think it's been the uncertainty of what's coming. I think people have had more time to, spend on education. I'm seeing a lot more people go to our Better Money Habits site and learn about deposits and savings. And I'm seeing savings accounts grow in centers that we weren't seeing it before. And I really feel like we're turning. But I think education, access to products, having a safe, reliable, transparent product that you're not going to get caught with overdraft or unexpected fees, what your balance is. Those are all really important things that institutions can provide that make a difference.
So Willie, Willie, I'm going to get you for this one.
Can I follow up on her?
Go ahead, follow up.
We don't want to do too much kumbaya, but I think there's also some things broken in the banking system. I think first off, the preponderance of the secondary market is part of what drives is a structural piece of the problem, because you're selling a standardized product to the secondary market, and most banks do that. I think there has to be incentives for different types of banks, and particularly banks who have a portfolio product. I think banks that just sell the stuff over and over to the secondary market, it's virtually impossible to affect somebody so far away. Banks are located and they have specific markets that they need to respond to, but the largest investments are really mortgages. And if those aren't managed through some part of the banking system, I think the incentive to grapple with these credit score issues, all the things that we're struggling with, I think there's no incentive in the banking structure to do that. I think that's part of what's broken.
So Willie, let me ask you this question. This comes from John Quinn, and he wants you guys to comment on how big banks and grassroots and historically African-American neighborhoods can work together to revitalize small neighborhoods, leveraging the bank's strength and talents. And I think this goes to, when I think of gentrification, typically it's not always thought of as strengthening the African-American neighborhood, though some of the things that come with it are really great. You get new stores, you get this and that. People move there because they were historically these neighborhoods that were African-American neighborhoods that have, it's quick to the city. It's got a good bus stop. It's got a good train route. So people want to be there. But that's not always very positive in terms of its outcome. But there is some opportunity here based on what John Quinn says about you grassroots organizations and banks working together for some of these smaller neighborhoods. Thoughts?
Well, I think there's a real mixed history. I think the examples I'm most familiar with where this has worked has been more community banks than large banks. First off, I think the second thing that you have to struggle through is underwriting and financing small businesses is a real different animal than doing mortgages. And so the problem we run into, particularly with minority businesses, is typically a net worth issue and a capitalization issue. So if the combination of all the things that have happened to you over the last 40 years makes you poor, then it's harder for you to launch a business. And as long as you are redlined or that your house is underappraised, it's hard for you to use that house as the equity to launch a business. So all of these things are kind of intertwined together. But I think part of what we have to grapple with, and I know people hate the R word, but we've got to find ways of equalizing access to capital, and we've got to find ways of being able to invest capital and more likely public capital as ways of getting some of our neighborhood business districts rekindled. And historically that has worked in some, the best model for that. That's what's happened. Main Street programs and things of that nature. And so I think part of John's question, and pardon my cynicism, I've just not seen with all the banking as they not gobble up each other, merge, acquisitions and mergers, I think is a better word, Christine. But I think as more and more of that happen, it's harder and harder for them to be functional at the Main Street level. So you need that's why local banks and community banks are so important, because they begin to fill that niche that allows you to create relationships with that banker and over time, build those relationships. You're gonna not, if you go to a major bank now and apply for a SBA loan, you know what the thresholds are, and most of the minority businesses won't qualify for those thresholds. That's that's a structural problem. I don't think it's because we don't want it as bad and don't work as hard. I think it's a structural problem.
Christine?
Yeah, I agree. There's a place for community banks. I think on a national level, or particularly with what I know from Bank of America, I don't think it's broken. I feel like there's more access to capital. I mean, just the SBA loan example you gave, we just did the Paycheck Protection Program to help small businesses, to give access to capital so that they could feed, give it to employees of their small business so that they could sustain through the environment. I mean, Bank of America alone gave 765,000 loans, over the course of the last 13 months. And community banks were there doing it too, CDFIs, but we were one of the largest and we gave it to the smallest groups. We're talking about 90+% of those small businesses had less than 10 people employed. So very small businesses, because we know they're part of the community. It's part of the fabric. We want to see them survive. I agree with you, Willie. There's got to be more investment and there's got to be more money put forward. And I've seen this and I've seen it in action. Our bank just raised the amount of money we're going to invest over the next several years to $1.25 billion. And this is around racial equality and economic opportunity. So it's all the things you're saying. It's about giving money to Black-owned small businesses. It's about creating jobs. It's getting more education and investing in those philanthropic and business opportunities. So it's a mix. I do think there's an opportunity for Bank of America to really make a difference in these neighborhoods you're talking about that are struggling, and helping them with the funds that they need at a local level. We are very focused on a local level. 1/3 of our financial centers are in low to moderate income neighborhoods. We're committed to that. We want to be part of those communities. We hire from those communities. Those are our employees that are working there serving those communities. And I really think it's philanthropic acts like that that are going to make a difference. And it needs to be a combination of institutions giving money and working with minority deposit institutions like MDIs or CDFIs as well. I think there's a place for all of us to make a difference, because there certainly is a lot of need here and a lot that needs to be addressed. But I see work that's underway and things that are making a difference now, that we just need more of it.
Geez, sorry about that. I do have this point, and there's an additional question that I want to bring up. I love the discussion, Christine, around root cause to the question that John brought up, because it really is root cause. And I think when institutions like Bank of America, organizations like Willie's, when you guys dig down and you understand the root cause of where these issues rise from, and it really is about the neighborhood. When we talked earlier about where the bus route is, where the stores are, I just recently saw a neighborhood and the grocery store is gone. So it's a African-American neighborhood, and the grocery store packed up and went away. And to me, those are perfect opportunities where businesses, corporate companies can come in and say, you know what, we're going to fill this gap. We're going to put a really great grocery store right back here where it came from. So I think to get to the root cause, to find the kinds of things that brings a tax base back into these communities, do you guys see that as important? It's important. And then just a second quick question to answer Ed's around appraisals. When appraisals aren't happening properly, that is taking wealth out of the pockets of people of color. So I guess you'll take the first one as a thought, but let's answer Ed's question around what can be done around appraisals and making sure that wealth stays where it belongs.
You should jump on that one, Christine.
I was going to let you start, Willie.
Appraisals myself. I think on the well, let me combine these two questions in one answer. There is an education issue, but there's also the structural racism issue. Some things just get looked at through a different set of lenses when they're in a Black neighborhood. And part of it you can educate out, but like I was talking, well, this is a deal that closed just before I retired. I was talking to the appraiser, and this was even after 2008, but he was saying that he was afraid to take certain numbers to his boss. So what that tells me is that within his organization, the expectation is to depress values within the African American neighborhood. And so I think if you can kind of expand that thinking for a second, when we start looking at business districts, a bunch of the business districts have been so depressed, sometimes because of racism and bad policy, but also sometimes never should have been there. Those things, I think the best solutions for those are certain forms of public investment so that you can get them to the point that private investment can be done on terms that are sustainable. Like the last thing you want to do is to put somebody in a weak neighborhood where there's no neighborhood plan that the city is bought into. There's no way of upgrading the utilities, the infrastructure, and all of that stuff. And so they inherit a loser. And all they're going to do is lose more with the loser. So part of what we pay our taxes for is to make sure that our public systems work and are able to generate value in the neighborhoods. And so I'm more of an advocate of holding our municipal governments accountable and to create ways that they can participate, et cetera. But most of the African American neighborhoods and small business districts, they're really undercapitalized in infrastructure. They're undercapitalized in building facades, Main Street issues, and so forth. And I think we have to step up and fight for those resources from our municipal governments.
Thank you, Willie.
I agree with Willie. Yeah, go ahead.
We're right at the top of the hour, so I'm going to let you go ahead and have your final thought, and then I'll have 10 seconds before I turn it over to April. So go ahead, Christine.
I think let me just say I always learn something when we get together. And Willie, thank you for, the education needed and the background, because I didn't have all of those pieces. And I would share, I think there's a lot more we need to do here. This is not a problem that's fixed. The new administration is introducing some new policies that give me hope, but government can't do it alone. It is going to take private, public, to your point, Willie, about municipal governments, and new policies put in place for us to really get to the root cause of this and make a difference. I think there's programs in place where we're starting to see opportunities with affordable housing and access to money available, but there's still this underlying current that needs to be addressed and brought into the open, and everybody needs to acknowledge it's there and start to solve for that.
Yeah. Willie, did you want to take 10 seconds?
Closing points. I think there's an important role for white advocates to play on issues of justice. The quieter people who know better are, the harder it is to make change. And so I think we have to find ways to educate, let's be blunt here. When more white people get involved in demanding stuff, more stuff happens. Okay, so it's important for all of us, black and white, to find ways of fighting for, advocating for the things that are important, that we believe is important to people, to poor people, people on the margins, people of color, and that we've got to find ways to make people more excited, comfortable, confident in their ability to be advocates within their own circles. I think that's a critical piece that we have to take responsibility for. And I think the second piece that's kind of tied to that is as shareholders, I don't own any stock in Bank of America, but as shareholders in we've got to find ways to also hold companies and people who do business in our neighborhood more accountable, and to be more active in not just accepting what they say on press releases, but to actually work to create neighborhood plans, present those, and argue for those as vehicles for investment.
I would agree. Now, before I turn it over to April, this is what I would say. There is some of the best content on CommonBondz right now on housing and wealth and the history of it. So if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, it is worth your time to take a look. Willie and Christine, this has been an awesome discussion for me. I loved doing the research for this, and I loved having the opportunity to talk to both of you. So I'm going to turn it back over to April.
Thank you, Finale. Wow, this has definitely been a very thought-provoking conversation. Wonderful, thought-provoking conversation. And so, Christine and Willie, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, for sharing this information with us. We definitely appreciate it. And it's, I was taking notes as well. And what I wanted to kind of echo is that, it's not a either or, it's a both and. And I think you both had really good perspectives and really good insights. And the lens is important. I wanted to bring that point to light. The lens that we look through is important. African Americans, our lenses are important. White people, your lenses are important because that's our name, CommonBondz. Together, there's a common bond. And we would hope that together, because it is a very layered, pressed down issue, and there are root causes and foundational causes, and so it's going to take all of us really to, like you both have said, and Finale too, it's going to take all of us to kind of unravel this thing and kind of get back to a good place for the country. So I just want to thank you guys for that conversation. And we are definitely going to continue this because it is really, home ownership is really the foundation for which people start to build wealth and pass it down. It's just, it really is. And for a lot of poor African Americans, it's a dream. It's something that a lot of people in low to moderate income communities, they don't see it because of the institutional and foundational challenges that we face. So we're definitely going to continue with this. As Mike mentioned, we're going to have series where we have teachings on financial literacy and those types of things, because it is definitely needed. So again, thank you. But before I go, I just wanted to make you guys aware. So this is officially our last speaker series for the season. For the summer months, we realized that people, go on vacations, and now that, things are opening up, our community will probably be traveling and those types of things. So this officially will be the last one. But we will have, we're going to continue staying connected. And I would ask that you guys please stay connected with us, because we're going to be active. We're going to do, for the summer months, a type of book club, and then we call it Chat for Change. So we stay tuned for communications from us regarding our book club. And it's not really, we're not going to begin with books. We're going to begin with articles, and short stories, things like that, so that we can all have time to read and participate. So in our newsletter and other communications, we're going to send out information about our book club for the summer, and it's called Chat for Change. So be on the lookout for that. Also, so that's for July and August. In September, we're going to have a big, because that's our 1-year anniversary, and we really want you guys to participate, because it's because of you that we have made it this far. So in September, we're going to have an annual celebration for a year-long CommonBondz in existence. So please look out for that. It's going to be really special, and we definitely want you guys to participate. I also thought it would be really good for us to put out a short survey to you guys, because we want to know, CommonBondz, Mike and I and our board members want to know how we're doing. We want to know what you guys want to talk about. We also want to know how we can improve these speaker series. And so towards the fall months, we're going to put out a survey. And so please, it's not going to be long. Just want to know your thoughts, your feedback, and how we're doing. So be on the lookout for a short survey from us. And I think that will be all the announcements that I have. Am I forgetting something, Mike Finale?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. So again, thank you guys for your participation. We thank you so much for your support. I say this all the time. This doesn't work without you. We can't do this without you. We need all of you. We need your support. We need your giving, if you can, so that we can continue to educate on what drives racism against African Americans, and together as the CommonBondz community work together to drive change. So thank you so much. We definitely appreciate you from the bottom of my heart, and I know Mike appreciates you. Thank you guys, and we look forward to hanging out in the summer during our book club, and then in September for our year-long anniversary speaker series. Thank you. Have a good night, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.